This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
Homicide detectives. They deal with a lot of things. They see a lot of things that normal everyday citizens would never know how to cope with. But what happens when a retired homicide detective writes an autobiography and leaves everything that he went through on the table? He truly has nothing left to prove. Join me as I talk to retired homicide detective and author Danny R. Smith on this episode of True Crime and Authors.
Welcome to True Crime and Authors Podcast, where we bring two passions together. The show that gives new meaning to the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction. Here's your host, David McClam.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome to the episode of True Crime and Authors. Of course, I'm your man, David McClam. Hey, if you guys haven't already, make sure that you're following us on all of our social media. One link to a link tree gets you to everything you need to get a hold of the podcast in the show notes. If you are looking at your calendars to follow the show, you know that it is yet again time for another author interview. And boy, do I have one for you today. Let me tell you about who our guest is. He has appeared as a subject matter expert on numerous crime podcasts and shows, including True Crime Daily and the STARZ channel's Wrong Man series. He is a member of the Idaho Writers Guild and the Public Safety Writers Association. He is the author of Dickie Floyd Detective Novel series, the Rich Farris Detective Novel series, and Nothing Left to Prove, a Law Enforcement Memoir. He is author Danny R. Smith. Danny, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks, David.
I guess my first question for you is, what was it like to be a part of the LA County Sheriff's as a homicide detective for 21 years?
Working homicide is without a doubt the most challenging, but also rewarding and perhaps even prestigious job that is available in law enforcement, in my opinion. It's the most important thing a person can do when you're investigating the death of a human being. There's no greater responsibility that a detective can have. So with the sheriff's department, you know, we all start out working. Usually we have a short stint in custody, and then we work patrol, and then you work your way through other assignments and kind of, different people have different ideas about what they want to do. Some want to promote up through the ranks. Some want to go to SWAT. Some want to be detectives. And I had chosen the investigation route. I wanted to be an investigator, and I made detectives at Firestone Station, and eventually went to detective division, working special investigations, Metro, and then homicide. So for me, I tell people getting to homicide is sort of like making the big leagues. You know, it's a whole different ball game there. You're treated differently. You have a lot more responsibility, but you also have a lot more freedom. And it was a really, really good assignment, a tough one, but a great assignment.
I know I read a lot of this in your book, but I don't have to give a lot away, so I ask you these questions, so I have no chance of running the book for anybody else. But how long does it take you to make a homicide detective or detective in general from start to when you first start out?
So to get to homicide, I mean, it's different for everybody. And you know, it was interesting. I wanted to stay in patrol longer than I actually did. I love patrol. Patrol is a fun job. Kind of the foundation of police work, right? You're driving around in a black and white. You're wearing a uniform. You're answering calls for service. You're chasing bad guys and bringing them to jail. And that's a lot of fun. And of course, when I was doing that, it was in the 80s and 90s, back when, the crack cocaine epidemic was hitting South Los Angeles. And that's where I was assigned. Gang warfare was at an all-time high. Homicide rates were stunning. And so if you're into excitement and you're a guy that likes, the adrenaline rush, for me, that was probably one of the most exciting times of my life looking back. And I hadn't planned to leave patrol when I did, but just a few things kind of lined up, and they say doors open, and you kind of have to pay attention to that. And I was asked to put in to go to our detective bureau, so I did, and I made detectives at Firestone Station. That was in 1980 or 91, and I'd been in patrol for 5 years. So the minimum to be a detective, I think, is 2 years of patrol. Usually people are in there at least 3 or 4 years before they go to detectives. So I did that, and I stayed there for another 5 years. I worked the detective bureau has a few different parts to it, and for the most part, I worked the night detective car, which to me was a great assignment. You're still suiting up and going out there in the field and doing police work rather than just day shift detectives. So I had fun doing that. I worked the crime impact team, and from that early part of my station detectives career, I started thinking, okay, I want to get to homicide because, again, that's the pinnacle. So for me, it was just, I was very fortunate. All my stars kind of lined up at once. I'd put in to go to special investigations and to go to homicide. And usually it takes people a few applications to get to either one of those assignments. And I actually got accepted to both units the first time I applied. And it was kind of shocking and surprising, but a great dilemma to have. And the two units basically worked out a deal where I would go to SPY for a year. That's what they call Special Investigations, SPY, SPI. I'd go to Special Investigations for a year, and then after that year, I'd go to Homicide, and that's what I did. So it was kind of a cool thing, and I was pretty fortunate to have everything work out that way.
So Nothing Left to Prove is the title of your memoir. Why did you choose that title?
That's a little bit of a spoiler alert because it's in the book, but that quote actually is derived from a conversation that my wife and I had when I had to leave law enforcement. I retired early. I hadn't anticipated retiring when I did. I got hurt on the job, and anyone in law enforcement will probably relate to this, but when you leave law enforcement, it's not like just leaving a job. You're leaving a family, you're leaving an identity. There are a lot of you find that it leaves some holes in you, and there's a big adjustment to moving on from law enforcement to the rest of the world. So it was a tough, very, very difficult time for me. And my wife actually said that to me when I was basically just having a difficult time with where I was in life and not knowing what I was going to do with the rest of my life, and feeling like I had left law enforcement prematurely. And we were talking about that and some other things. And that was just something that she said to me that really resonated. And she said, honey, you've got nothing left to prove. It's time to go on with the rest of your life. And it was just a very meaningful thing to hear, and a wonderful thing for her to have said. And there was no doubt when I was writing the book that was going to be the title. And truly, David, it's the theme of the book as well. I mean, the book, there a lot of law enforcement memoirs, they're full of war stories and things of that nature. And of course, mine has those things too. But there's a theme to my book that's different than most law enforcement memoirs you'll read, and that is basically the damage that the job did to me. I left there with chronic PTSD and some real physical ailments. And I was, as I say in that memoir, in the very first chapter, I was a broken man when I left, and it was tough to recover from that and to come out of that darkness. The book starts with showing that dark place I was in, and then it reverts back and shows my career and how I went from A to Z. and when you're done reading it, you'll say, wow, yeah, it's, thank God he made it through. And that's the feedback I get from people all over the country and beyond, that they're grateful for my service, and that I was able to pull through that. Like I said, I give my wife a lot of the credit for that. She was there for me when I was in my darkest moments, and she helped me put that in perspective, and realize that I'd done enough, and it was time to go ahead and move on.
I want to tell you, I definitely agree with that. Your book is different in that way, and I definitely appreciate it. I do thank you for your service. I've read a lot of memoirs that has been written by ex-cops, and you're the second one that I've dealt with that actually puts PTSD, the mental health, and what you went through out there and in front. I think off the air, I told you I interviewed a guy named Billy the Liquor Guy. He's the same way. He told us all about his PTSD, what he went through. He spent 12 years undercover, so he played different, variant roles. And I think what I need you to know, same thing I told him, is you're actually saving people's lives, right? A lot of mental health things people feel like, especially if you're in a tough job like law enforcement, it's something that you shouldn't say or keep behind. But when you get people of your stature that comes out and says, hey, this is what happened, I suffer from this, I'm a broken person, but this is how I survived, it works miracles. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. And I agree with you 100%. I've been amazed at the feedback I get on this book. It's only been out a year, and there's over 500 reviews on Amazon already. And it's been a bestseller, and it's just really done well. And the feedback I get from people all over, but especially from cops, it's almost alarming. First, let me say this. This book resonates with every cop, because my story is their story. It's a different story, but there are common threads to it. And I think that every cop, certainly every cop in this country, would relate to many parts of the book. But also, I have had a lot of people thank me for, being honest about, where I was and how the job affected me, because it's not a natural thing for us cops to bare our souls like that. And I felt like it was important because, a statistic that some people find shocking is, we have more law enforcement suicides every year than we do line of duty deaths. Those are just the ones that they actually classify as suicides, but there's a lot more. I mean, I have several friends that have drinking themselves to death, guys younger than me that they've been gone for years now, and old partners and good guys, good friends, and they're dead because they drink themselves to death. And those aren't called suicides, but they are, David. And the problem is that in law enforcement, we experience a lot and we live through a lot, and it affects each of us differently. And there's some people that make it through their careers and they don't have any problems at all. But there's a lot of people who leave there in a very dark place, as did I. And if they don't recognize that, if they don't have a good support system like I had, and they don't have a way to deal with it, it can be a very dangerous thing, a very volatile situation. So yeah, I truly wish every cop would read my book and take it to heart and say, yeah, it's okay to recognize that, that you're hurt, that you're in a dark place, that you cry, I mean, that you literally break down and lose it and fall apart at times, because we all do. It's just not that many people will admit it.
So I know that you've pretty much seen a lot, done a lot of things, just a few things you touched in the book, the crack cocaine epidemic. You was there for a spike in the homicides. You even been knocked out or took a beating that left you unconscious yourself. Because of all of these things, you do suffer from PTSD. I just want to know, how are you doing with that now? How does that affect your daily life at this point?
I have, there's two different types of PTSD. There's chronic and acute. And acute is typically diagnosed in a person that is traumatized by an event. And chronic, my shrink told me, is more, it's from an accumulation of traumatic events, and it's more aligned with what what they find in combat veterans, people returning from war. And the problem with chronic PTSD is it never goes away. It's there. It's kind of under the surface most of the time. And again, I've got a good support system. I've done things in my life to make sure that I can move on. And I'm pretty good at recognizing when I get dark. And I can tell you when I wrote my memoir, I went through a challenge. I mean, I definitely had a lot of, there was a lot of recollection in there that wasn't pleasant. And I started reliving some of that stuff and having some of those dreams at night, and, the restlessness and the fighting at night and things like that. So, it's an ongoing battle, but, the biggest thing is to have a good support system and also to be aware of where you are and how to deal with it.
Now, I won't go deep into it because I'll let people read the book for that, because I really want people to go out and read the book. But I have to ask, how are you around firearms now? I know that there was an incident at one point that you had one pulled on you. Does that change the way that you feel being around them? Do you still own any? I mean, how does that work out for you?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. And actually, I had a lot of them pulled on me over the years. But the incident you're referring to is the night I should have died. I had a guy pull a machine gun on me, a fully automatic open bolt machine pistol. And he dropped the hammer. He pulled the trigger, and that first round misfired. Otherwise, I'd be dead, and you'd have someone else on your show. To answer your question, I mean, I don't blame the firearm. It's I'm a fan of firearms. I have several myself, and I absolutely believe that we as Americans have the right to own and bear arms. And I think the responsible ownership and carrying of firearms is essential. But I've never looked at it like, gee, I wish there weren't guns in the world. That's never crossed my mind.
So the one thing I'm starting to find out is I've met more police officers and ex-police officers doing this podcast than I ever have, because the majority of you guys have retired, and there's a couple that I know that are still on the force, but you guys have all written books. So is this a way of an outlet of getting things out that you want to get, or is there something about being in law enforcement that maybe you didn't feel quite right about that you kind of want to right that wrong? Why do you guys turn into writers, in your opinion?
I turned into a writer because, believe it or not, my shrink suggested it. The questionnaire that was sent to me before I had my first visit with him, it asked some questions like, what about your job do you think causes stress? And, had a couple of lines to answer. And I said, well, that's not going to work. So I drew a big line across the questionnaire and I said, see attached. And I typed up a 14-page response. And when my shrink was reading it, that when we first met, he kept saying, you ought to write for a living. You ought to write for a living. Of course, I didn't really give much thought to that at the time. It wasn't my purpose or my idea. I had never planned to be a writer. If I had, I would have kept a daily journal throughout my career. It would have been helpful at this time. But no, I had never planned to write. But my shrink, he kept saying over and over, he says, man, he goes, you're a powerful writer. You've got a really good voice and you really articulate things well, and you ought to write for a living. I had to have a couple of surgeries. Part of the reason I left, I got hurt on the job, and I had 2 neck surgeries to take care of some ruptured discs in my neck. And during the recovery from the second surgery, I decided to try writing. And he had told me, he said, it's a very therapeutic thing, very therapeutic process to write. And I'd always enjoyed writing. I just never thought about being a writer. But I decided to try it because I was kind of homebound for a while, and I was bored to death anyway. So I tried my hand at writing, and I wrote a book, and I learned that, the old saying, you have to write a book to learn how to write a book, is true. And it was garbage. But I enjoyed doing it, and I liked the process of it. And I liked the fact that it was, in fact, therapeutic. So then I got serious about writing, and I some classes and started going to some seminars and met with some agents and editors, and had my work reviewed, and I went through a learning process. I don't know how to say this without it sounding. So some cops just write like they wrote their police reports, and it doesn't really make for good reading, even though it's entertaining. The story itself, usually is pretty interesting. And as a good friend of mine often says, he says, every cop's got stories in them, but I wanted to learn to write mine in a way that would be entertaining, that people would enjoy reading it. That's kind of the direction I took. And I've had some success, and I'm thankful for that and grateful for the people that read my books. But yeah, for me, it started off being therapeutic, and then just kind of turned into a passion.
So if anybody would have walked up to you and said, Danny, if you write books, you're going to be a very successful author and be where you are now, would you have believed them?
No, I mean, not back before I started or I tried. It was weird, David. I always enjoyed writing police reports, which most cops hate. I enjoyed the writing process, and so I guess I just kind of always had it in me and didn't really realize it. I started off by writing novels. I had written and published 7 novels before I wrote my memoir, and it took me that long because I retired in 2004. It took me that many years before I was even willing and able to write my memoir, because that is a whole different deal. That's the novels, it's mostly, fun to write those. But when you are going to dig down deep inside yourself and tell the true story about things, man, that's heavy. So I couldn't have written my memoir, within the first 10 years of being retired. I just couldn't have done it.
Well, I like to tell the audience, you guys need to read this man's books, because none of your books has lower than a 4.5 star rating. I've done my research on that, looked at all your books to see what people were saying. Everybody praises your books, and especially Nothing Left to Prove. I mean, it's carrying a 4.5. I think you're getting cheated there. I think that should be carrying a solid 5.
You always get, no matter what, you can go look at, Michael Connelly's books or Elmore Leonard or whoever your favorite author is, and check or click on the different stars and look at the 1-star reviews. I mean, you're talking about, you can go look at Stephen King and you'll find 1-star reviews. People just hammer them, this is garbage. So you're always going to get those. No one's going to have a 5.0 star average once you've gotten, a couple hundred reviews. It's just not going to happen. And people say the dumbest things in some of those bad reviews. It's like they're just haters. They just want to get on there and bash you because they hate you. And it's like, okay, whatever. And at first I took it personal. It was hard to kind of get to the point where you see those reviews and you just laugh. But in the beginning, it wasn't funny at all. I was kind of offended and upset and everything else.
It's the same way in podcasting, man. You could have a solid 5 review, and then you just release one episode that somebody didn't like, and that's it. You're the worst podcaster in the world. Don't listen to his show. So I definitely know how you feel on that rating scale. So your Dickie Floyd series, I do know that the 7th book of that is pre-orderable now. It does come out February the 2nd. It's been very successful. How did we come up with the Dickie Floyd series?
Well, that was the first, actually not the first book. I told you I threw the first book away. The first book I wrote was, it was not salvageable. It was like an old Volkswagen that had blown up and left oil everywhere. It just had to be hauled off the road and put in the salvage yard. But then the second book I wrote is the first book I published. And basically, because I'd spent the last 7 years of my career as a homicide detective, the theme was going to be, the homicide detectives. So the book was loosely based on me and one of my partners. And that's how the first couple of books kind of stayed with that theme. And then it evolved. Some other characters came in, and over the time, in fact, the 7th book is really interesting because in the 3rd book, Echo Killers, I introduce a new character, and it's a female named Josie Sanchez, and Josie's kind of a badass, and she's really cool, and she does some some really neat things. But I introduced her, and she kind of took over the show. I mean, it's just like if you go if you go look at the cover, you'll get an idea. She's just pretty cool, pretty cool gal, and she became one of the partners, and through the course of the following book, she kind of became more of a prominent character. And then in the program, I took a pretty big risk. I actually wrote the majority of that book from her point of view. So that was kind of tricky, and it was fun. But yeah, that the program is told mostly from Josie's perspective. I think people would enjoy it.
Now, you also wrote the Rich Farris Detective Novel. Is that kind of a spinoff of the Dickie Floyd series, or is that a standalone? And how are we supposed to look at that one a little bit differently?
So it's a spinoff, and kind of like Josie. What happened is Rich Farris was a background, a character in the Dickie Floyd series that in the first couple of books he's has these small roles. He was a character that just kept telling me that he wanted more, and he came to life on me. And in the sixth book, Unwritten Rules, he kind of like what Josie did is he really became prominent in that book. He and Dickie were very involved in this case, and he had some tragedies in his life. Rich Farris did, and the way that book ends, it just really was set up, and it parlayed into his own spin-off series very nicely. And the spin-off series, the first book in the Rich Farris series, is called The Outlaw. And that's a really interesting book because Rich Farris is black, and he gets involved with this case. He's off the job now. He's retired, but he has a relative who's murdered, and he gets involved in that case, and it occurs in Idaho. So he's kind of out of his element, and the killer, the outlaw that he's chasing, is this white supremacist type of guy that just had gotten out of prison. So it's a pretty interesting story. It's a wild story. I can tell you this: I had a lot of fun writing that book. It's kind of a crazy story, and it's fun, but yeah, it's different.
So what do you want readers to take away from Nothing Left to Prove?
The thing about that, the memoir is, like I said, I wish every cop or anyone who wants to be a cop or is thinking about being a cop, I would want them to read it. I would encourage them to read it. I think that most people, though, will take something away from it. One of the things I hear from a lot of people who are not in law enforcement, aren't married to a law enforcement officer, just the regular average citizen, is I've had a lot of people just say, wow, I've got more respect for law enforcement now than I did before I read the book. I can't believe what you guys can go through. And because I went through a lot in my career, and I don't think that people realize that a lot of cops go through a hell of a lot in their careers, and it is a sacrifice to do that work.
Well, I definitely do. I've always had respect for law enforcement. Reading your book, I definitely have a lot more, and it's definitely a lot more for you. I'm one of those people, I've never believed that a cop who is a bad cop, because let's face it, we do have some of those, they didn't come in that way. I think they got corrupted somewhere along the way. Some people just are not good with handling power like that.
Yeah, no, David, though, some of them did. I mean, that's another thing that people need to recognize and consider, is that we make mistakes. We hire the wrong people sometimes. There's people who have been involved. I mean, you look at the Rampart scandals, and David Mack, LAPD officer, and some of his cohorts, they grew up as thugs. I think one or two of them were actually, gangsters. And so, putting a badge on them is not going to change who they are. And in fact, it was the opposite. It allowed them to, kind of go off the charts with that stuff. And I mean, I remember when I was still on the job, we had a guy that was a deputy sheriff that he was hired and got through the academy, and he was working custody, and he got busted bringing heroin into the facility, and he was trafficking heroin into the jail. And it turns out he had grown up, being an associate of a street gang in East LA, and was taking, basically he was doing the work of the Mexican mafia, Miami, and bringing dope in. And when they arrested him, and I wasn't there, this is, what I was told. I believe it to be true, but they were going to put him in protective custody. And that's usually what happens when a cop's arrested. And he said, no, I'll walk the main line, because he wasn't a cop. I mean, he was, you know what I mean? But he wasn't. He had no fear of walking the main line, because, the people in jail, they knew who he was. They knew he wasn't really a cop. He's just wearing the uniform. And he had the protection of the Mexican mafia and, his fellow gangbangers. So, I mean, we hire the wrong people sometimes. To your point, other times we hire the right people and they become tainted. Environment's part of that too. I mean, on the West Coast, I think there's a lot less corruption than on the East Coast. But on the East Coast, I mean, there's been a history of some really bad corruption, and sometimes guys go into that thing innocent and maybe even naive, and next thing you know, they're being corrupted, and they're overwhelmed by the peer pressure, and they do things that they shouldn't do and never thought they would do, and they didn't hire on to do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I've never heard a take like that, especially from an officer. So I thank you for the insight, because I've always looked at that maybe they don't come in that way, but I guess in every aspect of life, you can always have a bad agent that is just looking to get in a position so that they have more power. So I appreciate that answer.
Yeah, you bet. And don't, make no mistake, some of these powerful organizations, whether you're talking about traditional mafia or the Mexican mafia or prison gangs like, Aryan Brotherhood, whoever, they need to cultivate people within the law enforcement community, because it's helpful to them to have people inside. And there's been plenty of cases where that's been revealed, and people have been identified and arrested for participating or facilitating, the criminal activities of, these organizations from within. So it wasn't that many years ago, and I know there's books about it. I can't remember the names, but there were two New York cops. They were homicide cops, and they'd been around forever, that were actually hitmen for the mob. They were doing murders. I can't think of the name of those guys offhand, but I know there's a book on it. But some of your listeners will probably know what I'm referring to. But that kind of stuff is like shocking, and it's crazy. But yeah, it happens.
Unfortunately, it does. So in closing, what would you like to say to all of your readers and fans out there?
Thank you. Honestly, David, this whole thing has been I didn't plan any of it. It's been a very enjoyable journey. It's a lot of hard work, but it's very rewarding that, not everyone loves my stuff, but there's a lot of people who do. And that keeps me going, and I hear from people constantly, and I always respond to anyone that contacts me. And some of these people end up becoming friends, and, to hear from people, to have them, tell me how much that they enjoy reading my books, or how much they've meant to them, or, especially with the memoir, to have cops, getting a hold of me and tell me, how it resonated with them. And then they tell me a little bit about their story, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just, it's remarkable to me, that I'm in this place now where I have this type of feedback and this type of support. It's just very unexpected, and I'm just kind of enjoying the ride.
Well, Danny, I do thank you for coming to the show today. I feel like I am a better person for having met you. I hope you consider me one of your new friends. You're welcome to come back on the show. at any time that you choose. Just let me know and we can have you back.
All right, David. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I absolutely would be honored to return to your show again someday. Thank you.
All right, guys, you heard it there. That was the incredible Danny R. Smith. You can pick up his books, the Dickie Floyd Detective Novel series, the Rich Farris Detective Novel series, and his memoir, Nothing Left to Prove, all from Amazon. And if you are an Amazon Kindle subscriber, you have no excuse for not reading them because they're all free to you under that $9.99 subscription. Be sure, though, that you read it. Just don't download it. Danny does not get paid unless you are turning the pages. So let's make sure that we support him. All of his links and information would be in the show notes, as well as attached to his episode on my website. All right, so thank you guys once again for tuning in. I hope you're all being safe out there. Be good to yourself and each other, and always remember these things. Always stay humble. A little love and compassion goes a long way. And this is the podcast where two passions becomes one. I'll catch you guys in the next one.
Thank you for listening to True Crime and Authors. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Join us on social media. On Facebook at True Crime and Authors. On Twitter at Authors True. On YouTube and TikTok at True Crime and Authors. And email at truecrimeandauthors@gmail.com. Cover art and logo designed by Dazzling_Ray from Fiverr. Sound mixing and editing by David McClam. Intro script by Sophie Wild from Fiverr. And I'm the voice guy, your imaging guy from Fiverr. See you next time on True Crime and Authors.